The bullet struck the wall just inches from Eleanor Martin's face, sending a cloud of dust and debris into her eyes as the cruel laughter of the bandits echoed down the deserted street of Redemption Creek. The year was 1876, and the promise of a new life in the West had quickly soured into a nightmare as she found herself surrounded by three men with faces hidden behind dirty bandanas and eyes that promised nothing but malice. Eleanor pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of the general store, her heart hammering against her ribs as she clutched her small coin purse to her chest. The meager savings inside represented 6 months of work as the town's schoolteacher, and now these outlaws wanted to take it along with whatever else they pleased. "Ain't polite to keep a man waitin', miss," drawled the tallest bandit, his voice carrying the rasp of whiskey and cigarettes as he took a menacing step closer. "Hand over that purse and maybe we'll let you walk away without no additional troubles." "Please," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant piano music drifting from the saloon. "This is all I have." The second bandit, a stocky man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his chin, chuckled darkly. "Heard you was the new schoolmarm. Pretty thing like you oughta know better than to walk these streets alone." He reached for her arm with dirt-encrusted fingers. "Maybe you need a different kinda education." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. There was no one to help her. Most of the town was at the evening church service, and those who weren't were drinking their troubles away at the saloon. She'd only stepped out to mail a letter to her sister back east, never imagining she'd be cornered like this. The third bandit, the shortest but most menacing of the group, drew a gleaming blade from his boot. "Boss says we ain't supposed to leave no witnesses these days. Too many lawmen sniffin' around." Terror paralyzed Eleanor as she realized these weren't just common thieves, they were killers. Her eyes darted frantically down the dusty street, searching for anyone who might come to her aid, but finding only empty boardwalks and closed doors. That's when she heard the thundering of hooves, moving fast and growing louder with each passing second. The bandits heard it too, turning their heads just as a midnight black stallion came charging down the main street, kicking up clouds of dust in its wake. Atop the magnificent beast sat a man whose face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but there was no mistaking the glint of determination in his eyes or the steady hand that held a Colt revolver. 2 shots rang out in quick succession, precise and controlled. The first bullet knocked the knife from the third bandit's hand with a metallic ping. The second splintered the wooden beam just above the tall bandit's head, a warning that the next one wouldn't miss. "I suggest you gentlemen find some other entertainment for the evening," the rider called out, his voice carrying a calm authority that belied the tension in the air. The scarred bandit reached for his gun, but the rider was faster, firing again and sending the weapon skittering across the dirt. "That's my final suggestion," the rider said, his tone hardening as he guided his horse closer, its nostrils flaring and hooves pawing at the ground. The bandits exchanged nervous glances, clearly weighing their options. Whatever calculation they made, the answer was clear: this wasn't a fight worth having. With muttered curses and promises of retribution, they backed away before turning and disappearing into the growing darkness between the buildings. The rider wasted no time. In one fluid motion, he extended his arm toward Eleanor. "Madam, I believe it's time for you to be elsewhere." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before grasping his forearm. With surprising strength, he pulled her up behind him on the saddle. "Hold tight," he instructed, and Eleanor wrapped her arms around his waist just as he spurred the stallion forward. They galloped down the main street, past the church where hymns could be faintly heard, past the saloon where drunken laughter spilled into the night, and toward the edge of town where the vast prairie stretched out beneath the emerging stars. Only when Redemption Creek was a collection of distant lights did the rider slow his horse to a trot and finally to a walk. The night air was cool against Eleanor's flushed cheeks, carrying the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers. "Are you hurt, madam?" the rider asked, turning slightly in the saddle. "No," Eleanor managed, her voice steadier than she expected. "Thanks to you, Mr. Vaughn." Victor Vaughn Davenport, he replied, removing his hat to reveal a face weathered by sun and wind, but handsome with striking blue eyes that caught the moonlight. He couldn't have been more than 30, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a day's worth of stubble shadowing his jaw. "Most folks just call me Vaughn, Eleanor Martin," she offered in return. "The schoolteacher." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I figured as much. Not many ladies in these parts wear spectacles and carry books instead of a derringer." Eleanor touched her wire-rimmed glasses self-consciously. "Well, Mr. Davenport, I'm afraid my Eastern upbringing didn't include lessons in marksmanship. Might be something worth remedying, considering the welcome you just received." Vaughn turned his attention back to the path ahead. "Those men, did you recognize any of them?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, I've only been in Redemption Creek for 6 months. I don't believe they're locals." "They're not," Vaughn confirmed grimly. "They ride with the Blackburn Gang, been terrorizing settlements across 3 territories." The name sent a chill through Eleanor. Even in her short time in the West, she'd heard whispered tales of the Blackburn Gang, ruthless outlaws who left a trail of bloodshed wherever they went. "What brings them to Redemption Creek?" she asked. Vaughn's shoulders tensed beneath his duster coat. "That's what I aim to find out." He glanced back at her, his expression softening. "But first, let's get you somewhere safe. Town's not secure tonight, not with those vermin skulking about." "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked, suddenly aware of how far they'd traveled from town. "My ranch is a few miles east of here. You'll be safe there tonight, and I can escort you back to town in the morning when the marshals had a chance to round up a posse." Eleanor knew she should protest a proper lady didn't spend the night at a stranger's home unchaperoned, but the memory of those bandits' eyes kept her silent. Safety trumped propriety tonight. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves against the earth and the occasional cry of a night bird the only sounds breaking the stillness. Eleanor found herself studying the set of Vaughn's shoulders, the confident way he handled his mount, the careful attention he paid to their surroundings. "You're not just a rancher, are you, Mr. Davenport?" she finally asked. Vaughn didn't answer immediately. "Used to ride with the Texas Rangers," he admitted after a pause. "Hung up my badge 3 years ago to try my hand at something more peaceful, and yet you still ride armed and ready for trouble." A soft chuckle escaped him. "Old habits, Miss Martin." "Out here, a man's caution often determines whether he sees another sunrise." The silhouette of a ranch house appeared on the horizon, a solid 2-story structure that spoke of prosperity and permanence. As they drew closer, Eleanor could make out a large barn, corrals, and several smaller outbuildings. A few lamps glowed in windows, casting warm rectangles of light into the darkness. "Davenport Ranch," Vaughn announced as they approached. "Not much compared to some spreads, but it's home." "It's beautiful," Eleanor said sincerely, taking in the careful craftsmanship evident even in the moonlight. Vaughn guided his horse to the hitching post near the front porch, dismounting with practiced ease before reaching up to help Eleanor down. His hands were strong and steady at her waist, and for a moment after her feet touched the ground, they stood close enough that she could catch the scent of leather and sage that clung to him. The front door opened, spilling light onto the porch as a stout older woman with iron-gray hair appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Davenport, was beginning to wonder if you'd gotten yourself into trouble again." Her sharp eyes took in Eleanor's presence with obvious interest. "I see you've brought company. Mrs. Wilkins, this is Miss Eleanor Martin, the schoolteacher from town," Vaughn explained, leading Eleanor up the porch steps. "She had an unfortunate encounter with some of the Blackburn boys. She'll be staying with us tonight, Mrs." Wilkins's expression darkened at the mention of the gang, but she quickly composed herself and offered Eleanor a warm smile. "Lord above, you poor dear. Come in, come in. I'll fix you a hot meal and prepare the guest room." The interior of the ranch house was a pleasant surprise, clean, well-appointed, with furniture that spoke of quality rather than ostentation. A fire crackled in the large stone fireplace, casting a warm glow throughout the main room. Mrs. Wilkins is my housekeeper and the finest cook in the territory, Vaughn explained as he hung his hat and duster on a rack by the door. She and her husband, Thomas, help me run the ranch. They live in the cottage just past the barn. It's lovely to meet you, Eleanor said sincerely to the older woman. And I'm terribly sorry to impose like this. Mrs. Wilkins waved away her concern. Nonsense, child, no imposition at all. Now sit yourself down while I fetch you something to eat. You look about ready to collapse. As Mrs. Wilkins bustled off to the kitchen, Vaughn gestured to a comfortable chair near the fire. She's right, you've had quite an ordeal. Eleanor sank into the offered seat, suddenly aware of how badly her legs were trembling. The events of the evening, the terror of being cornered, the thundering arrival of Vaughn on his magnificent horse, the daring escape all came crashing down on her at once. To her mortification, tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, hastily removing her spectacles to wipe at her eyes. "I don't normally. That is, I pride myself on keeping my composure." Vaughn crouched beside her chair, his expression gentle. "There's no shame in feeling fear, Miss Martin, only in letting it rule you, which you didn't. You stood your ground admirably." Eleanor managed a watery smile. "I don't know about that. I was frozen in place. Yet you didn't scream or faint or beg. Sometimes courage is just enduring until help arrives." He rose and moved to a cabinet across the room, returning with a small glass containing amber liquid. "It's just a little whiskey." "Medicinal purposes only," he added with a hint of a smile. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before accepting the glass. The liquor burned a fiery path down her throat, but the warmth that spread through her chest afterward was not unpleasant. Mrs. Wilkins returned with a tray bearing a bowl of fragrant stew, fresh bread, and a cup of steaming tea. "Eat up now," she instructed. "Nothing settles the nerves like a full stomach." The stew was delicious, rich with beef and vegetables, seasoned perfectly, and Eleanor hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. She ate with as much decorum as she could manage while Vaughn sat opposite her, cleaning his revolver with practiced movements. "How long have you been in Redemption Creek, Miss Martin?" he asked. "Since January," she replied between bites. "The town council wrote to my teaching college in Boston seeking someone to establish a proper school. I was eager for adventure, I suppose." "Boston to Redemption Creek is quite a leap. No family to keep you in the East," Eleanor's expression dimmed slightly. "Only a younger sister. Our parents passed away 2 years ago. Catherine, my sister, is finishing her studies at the ladies' seminary. I send most of my salary to support her education," understanding dawned on Vaughn's face. "That's why you were so reluctant to part with your purse." 6 months of savings, Eleanor confirmed. "I was going to send most of it to her tomorrow." Vaughn nodded, his jaw tightening. "The Blackburn Gang has a reputation for targeting working folks rather than banks or stagecoaches. Less risk, they figure, though no less reward when you tally up all the small thefts. Have they been in this area long? Reports started about 2 weeks ago. Small raids on outlying farms, a stagecoach robbery near Miller's Crossing." Vaughn reassembled his revolver with swift, sure movements. "Marshal Jenkins has been trying to organize a response, but they move fast and strike without warning." Mrs. Wilkins, who had been quietly moving about the room tidying things, snorted derisively. "Jenkins couldn't organize a prayer at Sunday service. Man's been 3 sheets to the wind since his wife left him last spring." "Martha," Vaughn admonished gently, though his expression suggested he didn't entirely disagree. Eleanor finished her meal feeling much steadier. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilkins, that was wonderful." The older woman beamed. "You're welcome, dear. Now I've prepared the guest room and left a nightgown and some toiletries for you. It's the second door on the right upstairs. The washroom is just across the hall." "You're very kind," Eleanor said, rising from her chair. "I don't know how to thank you both for your hospitality." "No thanks needed," Vaughn assured her. "I'll ride you back to town first thing tomorrow. Get some rest, Miss Martin." The guest room was small but charming, with a comfortable-looking bed covered in a handmade quilt, a small dresser with a mirror, and a rocking chair near the window that overlooked the ranch yard. Someone Mrs. Wilkins presumably had left a white cotton nightgown on the bed along with a brush, a bar of lavender soap, and a small towel. Eleanor washed her face in the washroom across the hall, changed into the nightgown, and brushed out her long auburn hair. As she settled into bed, exhaustion washed over her, but sleep proved elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the leering faces of the bandits or felt the jolt of the bullets striking the wall beside her head. After an hour of tossing and turning, she gave up and lit the small lamp on the bedside table. Perhaps reading would calm her mind, but she had no books with her. Wrapping the quilt around her shoulders, she decided to venture downstairs in search of something to read. The house was quiet, but a soft glow emanated from the main room. Eleanor descended the stairs carefully, not wanting to disturb anyone. To her surprise, Vaughn was still awake, seated in a chair by the now banked fire, a book open in his hands. He looked up at her approach, rising immediately. "Miss Martin, is everything all right?" Eleanor clutched the quilt tighter around her shoulders, suddenly aware of the impropriety of the situation. "I'm sorry to disturb you. I couldn't sleep and thought I might find something to read." Instead of the disapproval she half expected, Vaughn's expression was one of understanding. "Nightmares. They haven't had the chance to become nightmares yet," she admitted. "I can't seem to fall asleep at all." Vaughn gestured to the bookshelf that occupied one wall of the room. "Please help yourself. I'm not much of a scholar, but I enjoy a good book in the evenings." Eleanor approached the shelves, pleasantly surprised by the variety novels by Dickens and Twain, poetry collections, histories, and several volumes on animal husbandry and ranch management. She selected a slim volume of Tennyson's poetry. "An excellent choice," Vaughn commented, "though I warn you, The Lady of Shalott may not be the most soothing bedtime reading." Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile since the ordeal began. "You know Tennyson's work." "I may look like just another dusty cowboy, Miss Martin, but my mother was determined that her son would be educated." There was a warmth in his voice when he spoke of his mother. "She was a schoolteacher herself back in Virginia." "Was?" Eleanor asked softly, sensing the past tense was significant. "She passed during the war. Fever took her while I was away fighting." He didn't specify which side he'd fought for, and Eleanor didn't ask. The war had ended 11 years ago, but its shadows still stretched long across the country. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Vaughn nodded his acknowledgement, then gestured to the chair opposite his. "Since we're both awake, would you care for some company, or would you prefer to read alone?" Eleanor hesitated only briefly before taking the offered seat. Company would be welcome, actually. They talked quietly for the next hour about books they'd read, places they'd seen, the challenges and rewards of life in the West. Vaughn spoke of his time with the Texas Rangers with a mixture of pride and regret, hinting at experiences that had left their mark on his soul. Eleanor shared stories of her students, the mischievous Tucker twins, solemn little Mary Whittaker who had a gift for numbers, and boisterous Jimmy Parsons who could barely sit still but recited poetry with surprising eloquence. "You love teaching," Vaughn observed, not a question but a statement. "I do," Eleanor confirmed, "though I must admit, teaching in Redemption Creek is quite different from my training in Boston. Half my students come from farms and ranches miles away, attending only when they can be spared from chores. The other half are town children whose education competes with the allure of the saloon and the stories of gold strikes and cattle drives. Yet you stay." Eleanor considered the question implicit in his statement. "I stay because they need me. Because every mind deserves the chance to explore beyond its immediate surroundings." She smiled slightly. "And perhaps because I needed adventure more than I realized. Being cornered by the Blackburn Gang wasn't the sort of adventure you had in mind, I wager." "No," she admitted with a small laugh, "though being rescued by a former Texas Ranger might qualify." Vaughn's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, Eleanor noticed. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines earned through years of facing danger and hardship. "Well, Miss Martin, I believe our adventure has only just begun. Those men will still be in the area tomorrow, and they're not the type to forgive a humiliation." The reminder of the danger sobered them both. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the book of poetry in her lap. "Do you think they'll come after us specifically?" "They may," Vaughn answered honestly. "Though they'll think twice about approaching the ranch directly. I have a reputation of my own in these parts." He studied her for a moment. "Are you afraid?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "Yes," she finally answered, "but not paralyzed by it, not anymore." Vaughn nodded approvingly. "That's good. A healthy fear keeps you alert. It's when fear makes you reckless or helpless that it becomes dangerous." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional pop from the embers in the fireplace. Eleanor felt her eyelids growing heavy, the tension of the day finally giving way to exhaustion. "You should get some rest," Vaughn said softly, noticing her struggle to stay awake. "Dawn comes early on the ranch," Eleanor nodded, rising from her chair. "Thank you for the conversation, Mr. Davenport, and for everything else." "Vaughn, please," he requested. "Mr. Davenport was my father." "Vaughn," she repeated with a small smile. "Good night." "Good night, Eleanor," he replied, the sound of her name on his lips sending an unexpected warmth through her chest. Back in her room, Eleanor found that sleep came easily now, and when she closed her eyes, instead of Bandits' leering faces, she saw blue eyes crinkling at the corners with a smile meant just for her. Morning arrived with the crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee and bacon wafting up the stairs. Eleanor dressed quickly in her clothes from the previous day, thankful that Mrs. Wilkins had somehow found time to brush the dust off and press out the worst of the wrinkles. She secured her auburn hair in a neat bun at the nape of her neck, put on her spectacles, and headed downstairs. The kitchen was a hive of activity. Mrs. Wilkins stood at the stove, expertly flipping pancakes while keeping an eye on sizzling bacon. A tall, weathered man with a shock of white hair that Eleanor assumed must be Thomas Wilkins sat at the table, nursing a cup of coffee. Vaughn stood by the back door, deep in conversation with a young ranch hand who looked barely out of his teens. "And make sure the north pasture fence is secure," Vaughn was saying. "I don't want any strays wandering onto Mercer's property. Man's trigger happy when it comes to cattle that aren't his." "Yes, sir," the young man replied, his eyes widening slightly when he noticed Eleanor's presence. He touched the brim of his hat in greeting before ducking out the door. "Good morning," Eleanor said, feeling suddenly self-conscious as all eyes turned to her. "Miss Martin," Mrs. Wilkins exclaimed warmly, "come sit, breakfast is nearly ready." Thomas Wilkins stood, offering a polite nod. "Miss Martin, pleasure to meet you. Thomas Wilkins at your service." "Thank you, Mr. Wilkins," Eleanor replied with a smile. "I'm grateful for your hospitality." "How did you sleep?" Vaughn asked, moving to pull out a chair for her at the table. "Quite well once I finally settled," she answered, taking the offered seat. "Your guest room is very comfortable." Mrs. Wilkins set a plate loaded with pancakes, bacon, and scrambled eggs in front of Eleanor. "Eat up, dear. Sounds like you and Mr. Davenport have a busy day ahead." Eleanor raised a questioning eyebrow at Vaughn, who took the seat beside her with his own plate of food. "I need to go into town anyway," he explained. "Thought we might stop by the marshal's office first, report what happened, then I can escort you home." "That sounds sensible," Eleanor agreed, taking a bite of the fluffy pancakes. They were delicious, topped with butter and what tasted like homemade blackberry syrup. "Mrs. Wilkins, these are wonderful." The older woman beamed with pride. "Family recipe, the secret is buttermilk." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Thomas Wilkins spoke up. "Mr. Davenport, Jake mentioned seeing some unusual tracks by the East Creek yesterday. Might be nothing, but I'll check it out," Vaughn interjected, his expression serious. "After I return from town." Eleanor sensed there was more to the exchange than was being said, but she didn't pry. Instead, she focused on finishing her breakfast, all too aware that she'd soon be returning to town and to the reality of the danger that might still lurk there. After breakfast, Eleanor helped Mrs. Wilkins with the dishes despite the older woman's protests. "It's the least I can do after all your kindness," she insisted. "You're welcome here any time, dear," Mrs. Wilkins said warmly. "It's nice having another woman around. Gets lonely sometimes, being surrounded by nothing but men and cattle." "Have you worked for Mr. Davenport long?" Eleanor asked, curious about the relationship between Vaughn and the older couple. Going on 3 years now, Mrs. Wilkins replied, expertly drying a plate. Thomas and I were running a small stage station about 50 miles west of here. When the railroad came through, the stage line closed down and we were facing some hard times. She smiled fondly. Mr. Davenport rode in one day, said he was looking for a couple to help run his ranch, offered us fair wages and the cottage to live in, been here ever since. He seems like a good man, Eleanor observed, trying to keep her tone casual. Mrs. Wilkins's knowing look suggested she wasn't fooled. One of the best I've known, though he carries his share of burdens. Lost his wife and baby during the war while he was away fighting. Blames himself, I think, though there was nothing he could have done. Eleanor's heart constricted at this revelation. I had no idea he was widowed. Doesn't speak of it much, Mrs. Wilkins confirmed, but I see how he looks at you, Miss Martin. Haven't seen that light in his eyes for a very long time. Before Eleanor could formulate a response to this startling statement, Vaughn appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hat in his hand. Ready to head into town when you are, Miss Martin. Yes, of course, Eleanor replied, flustered both by Mrs. Wilkins's words and by Vaughn's sudden appearance. She dried her hands quickly on a nearby towel. Thank you again for everything, Mrs. Wilkins. The older woman enveloped her in a warm hug. You come back and see us soon, you hear. And be careful in town. Outside, Vaughn helped Eleanor mount his black stallion before swinging up behind her. The arrangement was more intimate than riding double with him behind her as they had the night before, and Eleanor felt herself blush as his arms came around her to take the reins. Sorry for the close quarters, he said, his voice close to her ear. Shadow's the fastest horse I have, and I want to be able to make a quick exit from town if necessary. It's fine, Eleanor managed, acutely aware of the solid warmth of his chest against her back. I understand the precaution. They set off at a steady pace, the morning sun warming the air as they rode. The landscape was beautiful in the daylight, rolling hills covered in prairie grass, stands of cottonwoods along distant creek beds, and the occasional rocky outcropping breaking the horizon. Your ranch is lovely, Eleanor commented. How many acres do you have? About 800, Vaughn replied. Small by Texas standards, but large enough for my purposes. I run about 300 head of cattle, mostly Hereford Longhorn crosses, hardy animals that do well in this climate. And you built all this in just 3 years. That's impressive. Vaughn chuckled, the sound rumbling against her back. Had a head start. Used my Texas Ranger savings to buy the land, and the previous owner had already built the main house. But yes, we've put in a lot of work. The Wilkinses, myself, and a handful of good ranch hands. It's not a large operation, but it's peaceful. The way he said the words suggested it was something he valued highly and hadn't always had in his life. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath them and the vast openness of the landscape, creating a strange bubble of tranquility that made the dangers awaiting them in town seem distant and unreal. All too soon, however, the buildings of Redemption Creek appeared on the horizon. Vaughn slowed Shadow to a walk as they approached the outskirts of town. Stay alert, he cautioned. The Blackburn Gang isn't known for subtlety, but they might have men watching the town. Eleanor nodded, her earlier sense of peace evaporating as they passed the first buildings. The town appeared normal at first glance, shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks, a wagon delivering goods to the general store, children playing a game of hoops in a vacant lot. But there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, evident in the way people's eyes darted to Vaughn and Eleanor as they rode past, in the hushed conversations that paused at their approach. Vaughn guided Shadow directly to the marshal's office, a small wooden building with a weathered sign and a hitching post out front. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Eleanor down, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. Stay close, he murmured, securing Shadow to the hitching post before leading Eleanor up the steps and into the office. Marshal Jenkins was a tall, thin man with a drooping mustache and tired eyes that had seen too much and cared too little. He sat behind a scarred desk, a half-empty bottle of whiskey within easy reach despite the early hour. He looked up with mild interest as Vaughn and Eleanor entered. "Davenport," he acknowledged with a nod. "Miss Martin, what brings you to my humble office this fine morning?" "Miss Martin was attacked by 3 members of the Blackburn Gang last night," Vaughn stated without preamble. "Cornered her near the general store around 8 o'clock. Jenkins's eyebrows rose slightly, the first sign of genuine interest. "The Blackburn boys, you say, in town?" "I intervened before they could rob or harm her," Vaughn continued, "but they're likely still in the area." Jenkins sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Been getting reports about them for weeks, hitting farms outside of town, scaring folks, but coming right into Redemption Creek." "That's bold, even for them." "They're getting bolder," Vaughn agreed grimly, "and if they're not stopped, they'll only get worse." Eleanor stepped forward. "Marshal, they weren't just after my money. They mentioned something about their boss saying not to leave witnesses these days." "I believe they intended to kill me." Jenkins's expression darkened. "That fits with what we've been hearing. Last month, they left a family alive after robbing their homestead near Splitrock Canyon. Those folks were able to describe the gang to authorities. Since then, there haven't been any survivors of their raids. "You need to organize a posse," Vaughn said firmly. "These men need to be brought to justice before more innocent people die." Jenkins laughed without humor. "A posse? With what men, Davenport?" "The town council won't authorize funds for deputies. Most able-bodied men are working their farms or ranches and can't afford to take time away. And the Blackburn Gang isn't just 3 men, it's 15 or 20 hardened criminals who won't hesitate to kill anyone who crosses them." "So you'll do nothing?" Vaughn's voice was dangerously quiet. "I'll send telegrams to the territorial authorities, same as I've been doing," Jenkins replied defensively. "Maybe they'll send marshals who are actually equipped to handle a gang this size." Eleanor could sense Vaughn's frustration and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Perhaps that's the wisest course for now, Marshal, but in the meantime, what about the safety of the townspeople? Especially now that the gang has shown they're willing to operate right here in Redemption Creek." Jenkins had the grace to look somewhat ashamed. "I'll organize extra patrols, ask for volunteers to keep watch at night, best I can do with the resources I have." It wasn't much, but it was something. Vaughn nodded curtly. "See that you do. And if you change your mind about that posse, you know where to find me." They left the marshal's office, the bright sunlight outside a stark contrast to the gloomy interior. Vaughn's jaw was tight with suppressed anger as he untied Shadow from the hitching post. "He's not going to do anything substantial, is he?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Jenkins is a decent man who's lost his nerve," Vaughn replied. "He's overwhelmed and undermanned, but that doesn't excuse leaving the town unprotected." He took a deep breath, visibly reining in his frustration. "Where would you like me to take you?" "Your boarding house," Eleanor nodded. "Yes, please. It's just past the church, the white house with blue shutters." They mounted up again, Vaughn carefully scanning their surroundings as they rode through town. People called out greetings to Eleanor as they passed Mrs. Peterson from the millinery shop, Mr. Granger, who ran the newspaper, and several of her students who waved excitedly. "You're well liked here," Vaughn observed. "I try to be a good neighbor," Eleanor replied. "Though I'm still very much the Easterner in many people's eyes." They reached the boarding house, a tidy 2-story structure with a well-kept garden. Vaughn dismounted and helped Eleanor down, his expression serious as he glanced up and down the street. "I don't like leaving you here," he admitted. "Not with the Blackburn Gang potentially still in town." "I'll be careful," Eleanor promised. "Mrs. Davidson, my landlady, keeps a shotgun behind the front counter, and I rarely venture out after dark." Vaughn didn't appear convinced. "Is there somewhere else you could stay, perhaps with a family from your school?" Eleanor shook her head. "I couldn't impose like that, and I refuse to be driven from my home by fear." She straightened her shoulders. "You've shown me that standing one's ground is sometimes the only option." A reluctant smile tugged at Vaughn's lips. "You're braver than you give yourself credit for, Eleanor Martin." The sound of her name on his lips sent a warm flutter through her chest. Thank you for everything, Vaughn. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along when you did. I'm glad I was there. His blue eyes held hers for a long moment, and Eleanor found herself wishing he would stay or that she could return to the peaceful sanctuary of his ranch, but such thoughts were impractical and improper. Will you be in town long? She asked instead. I need to speak with a few people, pick up some supplies, he replied. But I should head back to the ranch by mid-afternoon. Those tracks Thomas mentioned need investigating. Of course. Eleanor tried to hide her disappointment. Well, thank you again. Vaughn hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small revolver. Take this, he said, offering it to her. It's a Colt pocket model, small enough to fit in a drawer or reticule, but effective at close range. Eleanor stared at the weapon, uncertainty clear on her face. I've never fired a gun before. It's simple enough, Vaughn explained, gently placing it in her hands. Just cock the hammer, aim, and squeeze the trigger, 5 shots before you need to reload. He showed her the basic mechanism, his hands guiding hers with careful precision. I'd feel better knowing you had some protection. The weight of the revolver was both frightening and oddly reassuring. Eleanor nodded slowly. Thank you, I hope I won't need to use it, as do I. Vaughn's fingers lingered on hers for a moment before he stepped back. Be vigilant, Eleanor. If anything seems amiss, anything at all, don't hesitate to seek help. I promise. She tucked the revolver into her pocket, where its weight pressed against her thigh, a constant reminder of both danger and protection. With obvious reluctance, Vaughn mounted Shadow once more. I'll check on you when I'm next in town, he said. Probably within the week. Eleanor nodded, surprising herself with how much she looked forward to seeing him again. I'd like that. With a final tip of his hat, Vaughn turned his horse and rode back toward the center of town, his straight-backed figure commanding attention from everyone he passed. Eleanor watched until he disappeared around a corner, then turned and entered the boarding house, her mind filled with blue eyes, gentle hands, and the unexpected feeling that her life had somehow irrevocably changed in the span of a single night. The next few days passed in a strange combination of normalcy and heightened vigilance. Eleanor taught her classes, marked papers, and went about her usual routines, but always with an awareness of potential danger. The small revolver Vaughn had given her stayed close at hand in her desk drawer during school hours, in her pocket or reticule when she ventured out, and beside her bed at night. News of her encounter with the Blackburn Gang had spread quickly throughout the small town, and Eleanor found herself the recipient of concerned inquiries and well-meaning advice. Several of the town's matrons suggested she find a position in a more civilized location, while others praised her courage in remaining at her post. The fathers of her students made a point of escorting their children to and from school, often lingering to ensure Eleanor was safely locked inside the schoolhouse before departing. On Wednesday afternoon, as Eleanor was dismissing her students for the day, a commotion outside drew her attention. She stepped onto the schoolhouse porch to find several townspeople gathered in the street, their faces grim as they listened to a dust-covered farmer whose wagon stood nearby. Burned everything they didn't take, the man was saying, his voice ragged with emotion. My wife and children were hiding in the root cellar, thank the Lord, but if they'd been found. He trailed off, the unspoken horror hanging in the air. Marshal Jenkins stood before the crowd, his face haggard. The Blackburn Gang hit the Peterson place this morning, he announced, raising his voice to be heard by all. This makes 3 farms in the past week. They're getting bolder, moving closer to town each time. A murmur of fear rippled through the gathered townspeople. What are you going to do about it, Jenkins? Called out Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith. We can't just sit here waiting to be next. I've sent telegrams to Fort Laramie, Jenkins replied. The Army has promised to send a detachment, but it could be days before they arrive. In the meantime, I'm calling for volunteers for a town watch. No one goes anywhere alone, especially after dark. Eleanor listened with growing unease. The Peterson farm was less than 10 miles from town, much closer than previous attacks. The gang was indeed growing bolder, perhaps emboldened by the lack of effective resistance. As the crowd dispersed, Eleanor found herself approached by Abigail Turner, the young widow who ran the town's small dressmaking shop. "Miss Martin, I couldn't help noticing you haven't had Mr. Davenport's protection these past few days," Abigail said, her voice carrying just enough innuendo to make her meaning clear. Eleanor's cheeks warmed. "Mr. Davenport merely assisted me during a dangerous situation, Mrs. Turner. He has his own responsibilities to attend to." Abigail's painted lips curved in a knowing smile. "He's quite the catch, you know, owns one of the most prosperous small ranches in the territory, and so handsome too. Half the unmarried women in the county have set their caps for him, but he's shown interest in none of them." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Until now, that is. Mary Johnson at the general store said he asked after your welfare most particularly when he was in town yesterday." "Did he?" Eleanor couldn't help the small flutter of pleasure this news caused, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "That was kind of him." "Kind indeed," Abigail echoed with a meaningful glance. "Well, I should be getting back to my shop. Do be careful, Miss Martin. These are dangerous times." As Abigail walked away, Eleanor found herself wondering about Vaughn's visit to town. He hadn't come to see her, which was perfectly reasonable. They were barely acquaintances, after all. Yet the knowledge that he had inquired after her welfare stirred something warm in her chest. That evening, Eleanor sat in her small room at the boarding house, grading arithmetic papers by lamplight. The night was unusually still. The typical sounds of the small-town piano music from the saloon, laughter, the occasional shout or horses neigh oddly absent. Perhaps the news of the latest raid had driven people to the safety of their homes earlier than usual. A soft knock at her door startled her. "Miss Martin," called Mrs. Davidson, her landlady, "there's a gentleman here to see you." Eleanor's heart quickened. "I'll be right down," she called back, hastily tidying her hair in the small mirror before descending the stairs to the boarding house's front parlor. Vaughn stood by the window, hat in hand, his tall figure silhouetted against the fading evening light. He turned as she entered, and the intensity of his gaze sent a warmth flooding through her that had nothing to do with the stuffy parlor. "Miss Martin," he greeted her with a slight bow, "I hope I'm not intruding on your evening." "Not at all," Eleanor assured him, aware of Mrs. Davidson hovering in the doorway, ears practically pricking forward with interest. "It's good to see you, Mr. Davenport." "I'll bring some tea," Mrs. Davidson announced, clearly intending to remain within earshot of their conversation. Once the landlady had departed, Vaughn stepped closer to Eleanor, his voice dropping. "I can't stay long. I've been tracking the Blackburn Gang's movements. They've established a camp about 15 miles northwest of here in the foothills." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You've been tracking them?" "Alone, that's incredibly dangerous, Vaughn." A small smile touched his lips at her use of his first name. "I was a ranger for 8 years, Eleanor. Tracking outlaws is something of a specialty." "Still," she protested, "these men are killers." "If they'd caught you, they didn't," he interjected gently. "And now we know where they are. Jenkins is finally organizing a posse. We ride at dawn." Eleanor felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. How many men? 12 so far. Mostly ranchers and farmers from the outlying areas, men who are tired of living in fear of the next raid. Vaughn's expression was grimly determined. "The Blackburn Gang has about 20 men, but they won't be expecting us. We have the element of surprise." 20 against 12 are not favorable odds, surprise or no, Eleanor pointed out, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Vaughn stepped closer, close enough that she could catch the scent of leather and sage that seemed uniquely his. "That's not why I came," he said softly. "I came to ask if you would consider staying at the ranch while we're gone. Mrs. Wilkins would welcome the company, and I'd feel better knowing you were safely away from town. If the posse fails, you think they might retaliate against the town?" Eleanor asked, the implications sending a chill through her. "It's possible. Men like the Blackburn Gang don't take kindly to resistance." Vaughn's blue eyes were serious. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't think it was important." Eleanor considered his request. The thought of being away from town during such a dangerous time was appealing, and she had felt safe at the ranch. But there were her responsibilities to consider. "What about my students?" she asked. "I can't simply abandon my teaching duties." "School has been canceled for the rest of the week anyway," Vaughn informed her. "Jenkins's orders. Most families are staying close to home until this situation is resolved, Mrs. Davidson returned with the tea tray before Eleanor could respond, setting it on the small table with exaggerated care while casting curious glances between them. "Thank you, Mrs. Davidson," Eleanor said pointedly. "That will be all." The landlady looked disappointed but withdrew. Though she left the parlor door conspicuously ajar, Vaughn's lips twitched with suppressed amusement as he accepted the cup of tea Eleanor offered him. "Small towns," he murmured. "Everyone's business is everyone's business." "Indeed," Eleanor agreed with a small smile. "Mrs. Turner informed me that you had asked after my welfare yesterday. Did she now?" Vaughn didn't seem embarrassed by this revelation. "I did stop by the school, but you were in the middle of a lesson. I didn't want to interrupt." The thought of him watching her teach sent a curious flutter through Eleanor's chest. "I appreciate your concern," she said softly. They sipped their tea in companionable silence for a moment before Vaughn returned to his request. "Will you consider coming to the ranch, Eleanor?" "Just until this business with the Blackburn Gang is settled." The genuine concern in his eyes touched something deep within her. "Yes," she decided. "I'll come." Relief washed across Vaughn's features. "Thank you. I'll have Thomas come for you at first light before the posse rides out." He set down his teacup and rose to leave. "I should go. There are preparations to make before tomorrow." Eleanor walked him to the door, acutely aware of Mrs. Davidson's eyes following them from the sitting room across the hall. At the threshold, Vaughn paused, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Be careful, Eleanor," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Keep that revolver close tonight." "I will," she promised. "And you," she hesitated, emotions welling up unexpectedly. "Come back safely, Vaughn." Something flickered in his eyes' warmth and perhaps surprise at her obvious concern. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "I intend to," he said simply, before placing his hat on his head and stepping out into the gathering darkness. Eleanor watched from the doorway until his figure disappeared into the night, her heart racing with a mixture of fear for tomorrow and the lingering sensation of his fingers against her skin. True to Vaughn's word, Thomas Wilkins arrived at the boarding house just as the first pale light of dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. Eleanor was ready, having packed a small valise with essential items and spent a largely sleepless night fretting about the coming confrontation between the posse and the Blackburn Gang. "Morning, Miss Martin," Thomas greeted her, his weathered face solemn as he helped her into the wagon. "Mr. Davenport asked me to give you this." He handed her a folded note, which Eleanor opened with fingers that trembled slightly. "Eleanor," it read in a strong, decisive hand. "The posse assembles at sunrise. By the time you read this, we will be on our way to the Blackburn camp. Stay at the ranch with the Wilkinses until word comes of our success. If you haven't heard anything by tomorrow evening, Thomas knows what to do. Be safe. Vaughn." The brevity of the note and its ominous final instructions sent a chill through Eleanor despite the warm morning air. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. "How many men joined the posse, Mr. Wilkins?" she asked as they set off, the wagon rattling over the rutted road leading out of town. 15 last I heard," Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "More than expected. Word of the Peterson raid stirred up a lot of anger. Still outnumbered," Eleanor observed quietly. Thomas nodded grimly. "True enough, but Mr. Davenport has a plan, always does." They rode in silence for a while, the early morning landscape bathed in golden light that belied the danger facing the men of Redemption Creek. Eleanor found her thoughts returning repeatedly to Vaughn, his quiet confidence, the intensity of his blue gaze, the gentle brush of his fingers against her cheek. She barely knew him, yet the thought of him riding into danger filled her with a dread that felt deeply personal. "Mr. Davenport is a good man," Thomas said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "Best I've known, gave Martha and me a chance when nobody else would, treats his hands fair, stands by his word." "He seems to inspire great loyalty," Eleanor noted. Thomas nodded. "Does it that? Men in the posse would follow him anywhere, even though he's not wearing a badge. They trust his judgment." He glanced sideways at Eleanor. "He's taken a shine to you, you know, never seen him quite so attentive to anyone since I've known him." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "We've only just met, Mr. Wilkins. Sometimes that's all it takes," the older man replied with a knowing smile. "My Martha and I, we knew within a week of meeting that we'd be spending our lives together. Been 42 years now." Eleanor didn't know how to respond to this, so she remained silent, watching the landscape roll by as they made their way to the Davenport ranch. Her thoughts were a confused jumble: concern for Vaughn and the posse, uncertainty about her growing feelings for a man she barely knew, and a persistent fear about what the coming days might bring. They arrived at the ranch mid-morning to find Mrs. Wilkins waiting anxiously on the porch. Her face brightened at the sight of Eleanor. "Thank goodness you're here safely," she exclaimed, hurrying down to help with Eleanor's valise. "Any news from town?" "The posse rode out at sunrise," Thomas reported, helping Eleanor down from the wagon. 15 men altogether, Mrs. Wilkins's expression tightened with worry. "I've prepared the guest room for you, Miss Martin. Come inside, I've got coffee brewing and biscuits just out of the oven." The familiar routine of domestic tasks proved to be a blessing as the day wore on. Eleanor helped Mrs. Wilkins with various chores around the house, finding that physical activity helped keep her worries at bay. They prepared a large midday meal for the ranch hands, mended shirts, and preserved the last of the summer's peaches in sticky sweet syrup. "Mr. Davenport mentioned you were widowed during the war," Eleanor said carefully as they worked side by side in the kitchen. "I'm very sorry." Mrs. Wilkins's hands stilled briefly before resuming their practiced movements. "Thank you, dear. It was a long time ago now. Anthony was a good man. Died at Gettysburg fighting for the Union. And Mr. Davenport, I understand he lost his wife and child." Eleanor tried to keep her tone casual, though her heart ached at the thought of the pain he must have endured. "Yes," Mrs. Wilkins confirmed softly. "Sarah was her name. Lovely young woman from a good Virginia family. They married just before the war broke out. Mr. Davenport joined the Confederate cavalry, felt it was his duty to his state, though I don't think his heart was ever truly in the cause." She sighed deeply. "Sarah was expecting their first child when he left. She died in childbirth while he was away fighting, and the baby, a little girl, didn't survive either. By the time word reached him, they'd been in the ground for 2 months. Eleanor blinked back tears. "How terrible for him." "It broke something in him," Mrs. Wilkins admitted. "He doesn't speak of it, but I've seen him standing at the window on certain nights, looking out at nothing with such grief in his eyes." She glanced at Eleanor. "Until recently, that is, since you came along, there's been a change in him. A lightness I haven't seen before." "I hardly think I could have such an effect," Eleanor protested, though her heart quickened at the thought. "We've barely spent any time together." Mrs. Wilkins smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the heart recognizes what it needs even when the head isn't ready to admit it." Before Eleanor could formulate a response, the distant sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Both women hurried to the window, but their hopes for news were dashed when they saw it was only one of the younger ranch hands returning from checking the herd. "It's too early anyway," Mrs. Wilkins said, returning to her work. Even if everything went as planned, they wouldn't be back before nightfall. The rest of the day passed with agonizing slowness. By evening, Eleanor found herself unable to concentrate on anything for long. She paced the front room, alternating between staring out the window at the empty road and attempting to distract herself with a book from Vaughn's shelf. Night fell with no word from the posse. Thomas Wilkins set out lanterns along the drive to guide any returning riders, while Mrs. Wilkins prepared a simple supper that none of them had much appetite for. Eleanor retired to the guest room early, though she knew sleep would be elusive, Lying in the darkness, she found herself dwelling on what Mrs. Wilkins had said about Vaughn, about the grief he carried, and the change she'd noticed in him recently. Was it possible that in their brief encounters, something significant had begun to form between them? The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Eleanor must have eventually drifted off, for she awoke with a start to the sound of voices downstairs. Glancing at the small clock on the bedside table, she saw it was just past midnight. She hastily pulled on a robe over her nightgown and hurried to the top of the stairs. "Ambushed us in the canyon," a tired voice was saying. "They must have had scouts watching the town, knew we were coming." Eleanor's heart froze. She recognized that voice. Vaughn, he was alive. She hurried down the stairs to find him standing in the front room, his clothes dusty and torn, a bloodied bandage wrapped around his left forearm. His face was haggard with exhaustion, but his eyes brightened when he saw her. "Eleanor," he said, her name a relief on his lips. "You're safe." "You're hurt," she replied, hurrying to his side. "What happened? The posse, we lost 2 men, Vaughn reported grimly. Henderson the blacksmith and young Billy Parker from the livery, 3 others wounded, but they'll recover. The Blackburn Gang scattered, but we managed to capture 5 of them, including Blackburn himself." "Thank God," Mrs. Wilkins breathed, pressing a hand to her heart. "Jenkins is taking the prisoners to Fort Laramie for trial," Vaughn continued. "The rest of the gang fled north toward the territories. With their leader captured, they'll likely disband." "And your arm?" Eleanor asked, gently touching the bloodied bandage. "Just a graze," Vaughn assured her, though the tightness around his eyes suggested it was more painful than he let on. "Mrs. Wilkins, if you wouldn't mind heating some water, the wound needs cleaning." "Of course," the older woman replied, hurrying to the kitchen. "Let me help," Eleanor insisted, guiding Vaughn to a chair near the fire. "I have some experience with treating injuries. I volunteered in a field hospital during the last year of the war." Vaughn allowed her to help him remove his coat and roll up his sleeve, revealing a long gash that, while not dangerously deep, was certainly more than a mere graze. Eleanor examined it carefully in the firelight. "This needs proper cleaning and stitching," she declared. "It's not just a scratch, Vaughn," he managed a tired smile. "I've had worse." "That's not particularly reassuring," Eleanor replied, accepting a basin of hot water and clean cloths from Mrs. Wilkins. "Do you have a medical kit?" "Needle and thread, alcohol, in the cabinet in the study," Vaughn directed. "Thomas, would you mind?" As Thomas went to fetch the supplies, Eleanor began carefully cleaning the wound, acutely aware of Vaughn's eyes on her face as she worked. His arm was muscular beneath her fingers, the skin tanned from long days in the sun. Despite the circumstances, she found herself distracted by the simple intimacy of tending to him. "You have gentle hands," he observed softly. Eleanor felt herself blush. "I've had practice. The hospital where I volunteered received many wounded from the Virginia campaigns." She hesitated, then added, "I know you fought for the Confederacy." Vaughn's expression sobered. "I did, though by the end I wasn't fighting for a cause so much as for the men beside me." He watched as she finished cleaning the wound. "Does that trouble you?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "The war divided us all in ways that may never fully heal, but no, it doesn't trouble me. We all did what we thought was right at the time." Thomas returned with the medical kit, and Eleanor efficiently threaded a needle and sterilized it over a flame. "This will hurt," she warned Vaughn. "I trust you," he replied simply, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Eleanor focused on the task at hand, her stitches neat and precise as she closed the wound. Vaughn barely flinched, though she knew it must be painful. When she finished, she bandaged his arm with clean linen and sat back, satisfied with her work. "Thank you," Vaughn said, his voice low and intimate in the quiet room. Mrs. Wilkins, who had been hovering nearby, cleared her throat. "You must be hungry," she said to Vaughn. "I'll warm up some stew." "That would be wonderful, Martha, thank you," Vaughn replied, though his eyes never left Eleanor's face. As the Wilkinses busied themselves in the kitchen, Eleanor and Vaughn were left alone by the fire. The events of the past days seemed to hang between them, the danger, the fear, the moments of unexpected connection. "I was worried," Eleanor admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "when night fell and there was no word." "I'm sorry for causing you concern," Vaughn said, reaching out with his uninjured arm to take her hand. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "But I'm glad you were here safe while we dealt with the Blackburn Gang. Will they truly disband without their leader?" Eleanor asked. "Most likely, men like that follow strength. Without Blackburn to hold them together, they'll scatter to the winds." Vaughn's expression darkened, "though there'll always be others to take their place. The West is still wild in many ways. And what happens now?" Eleanor asked, the question encompassing more than just the immediate future. Vaughn seemed to understand the deeper meaning behind her words. His blue eyes searched hers for a long moment before he spoke. "Now life in Redemption Creek returns to normal. School resumes. Ranchers tend their herds. And perhaps," he hesitated, his hand tightening slightly around hers, "perhaps a former Texas Ranger finds the courage to call on a certain schoolteacher, properly this time, no bandits or posses or life-threatening situations, just a man asking a woman if she might consider spending time with him." Eleanor's heart quickened at his words. "I think the schoolteacher would like that very much," she replied softly, though she might admit that danger has a way of revealing truths that might otherwise remain hidden. A smile spread across Vaughn's tired face, transforming it in the firelight. "Then perhaps I owe the Blackburn Gang a small debt of gratitude after all." Their quiet laughter mingled in the warm room, and as their eyes met in shared understanding, Eleanor felt a certainty settle over her heart. Whatever began that night when Vaughn rode to her rescue was only the beginning of a much longer story. The weeks that followed the defeat of the Blackburn Gang brought significant changes to Redemption Creek and to Eleanor's life in particular. The town celebrated its deliverance with an impromptu festival on the town square, music, dancing, and enough food to feed twice the population. Marshal Jenkins, buoyed by his success and the subsequent praise, swore off the bottle and petitioned the town council for funds to hire 2 deputies. The families who had lost loved ones to the gang's brutality found some measure of peace in knowing that justice would be served. For Eleanor, the most significant change was in her relationship with Vaughn. True to his word, he began calling on her properly Sunday afternoon rides across the prairie, escort to and from church services, occasional dinners at the town's small restaurant. Their courtship was conducted under the watchful and often approving eyes of the townspeople, who had collectively decided that the schoolteacher and the rancher made a fine match indeed. On a crisp October afternoon, Eleanor sat on a blanket spread beneath a towering cottonwood tree at the edge of Vaughn's property, a picnic basket beside her and a book of poetry open in her lap. Vaughn lay stretched out beside her, his hat tipped over his face to shield his eyes from the dappled sunlight filtering through the golden leaves above. "Read me another," he requested, his voice lazy with contentment. Eleanor smiled and turned the page. "This is from Tennyson's The Princess sweet and low, wind of the western sea." As she read, Vaughn reached out to take her hand, his thumb tracing idle patterns across her skin. The simple touch sent warmth spiraling through her, as it always did. 6 weeks of courtship had only deepened the connection that had begun that night when he'd rescued her from the bandits. When she finished reading, Vaughn sat up, his expression suddenly serious. "Eleanor, there's something I've been wanting to ask you," her heart quickened at his tone. "Yes." He took both her hands in his blue eyes intent on her face. "These past weeks have been the happiest of my life. I know it hasn't been long, but I feel as though I've known you always." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "I love you, Eleanor Martin. I think I began falling in love with you the moment I saw you standing against that wall, frightened but unbowed, and every day since has only confirmed what my heart knew immediately." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as joy flooded her chest. "Oh, Vaughn, I love you too." The smile that broke across his face was radiant. "Then would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" I know I'm asking you to give up your teaching, to take on the life of a rancher's wife, which isn't always easy. But I promise to make you happy, to cherish you every day of our lives together." Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I will marry you, Vaughn Davenport." He kissed her then, tenderly at first, then with growing passion, a seal on their promise and a testament to the love that had blossomed between them against all odds. When they finally parted, both breathless, Vaughn reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "This was my mother's," he explained, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single perfect diamond. "She gave it to me before she died, told me to save it for when I found a love worthy of its history." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Eleanor felt tears of happiness spill onto her cheeks. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I'll treasure it always." They were married 2 weeks later in Redemption Creek's small church with nearly the entire town in attendance. Mrs. Wilkins wept openly throughout the ceremony, while Thomas stood proudly as Vaughn's best man. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk that Abigail Turner had worked night and day to complete in time, adorned with lace sent by her sister Catherine from Boston. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Vaughn lifted Eleanor's veil with trembling hands and kissed her with such tenderness that several of the town's matrons dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The celebration that followed at the town hall lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and enough good wishes to last a lifetime. Later, as Vaughn carried her across the threshold of their home now, Eleanor felt a deep sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged, with this man who had ridden into her life when she needed him most, and had stayed to become everything she'd never known she wanted. "Welcome home, Mrs. Davenport," Vaughn murmured against her hair as he set her gently on her feet in the front room. "It feels like I've been coming home since the moment I met you," Eleanor replied, reaching up to touch his beloved face. "As though everything in my life was leading me here to you." Their kiss sealed this new beginning, this promise of a future built on love that had been forged in danger but would flourish in peace. Spring came early to the territory the following year, painting the prairie with wildflowers and new growth. Eleanor stood on the porch of the ranch house, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly as she watched Vaughn work with a young colt in the corral. 6 months of marriage had only deepened their bond, each day bringing new discoveries and shared joys. The news of the baby, delivered by the town doctor just 2 weeks prior, had brought Vaughn to his knees with emotion. The shadow of his past loss had briefly darkened his eyes before being replaced by a cautious joy that grew stronger with each passing day. He had become tenderly protective, insisting that Eleanor rest frequently and enacting a strict moratorium on horseback riding, despite her protests that women had been having babies on the frontier since time immemorial. As she watched him now, his skilled hands gentle with the nervous colt, his patience evident in every movement, Eleanor felt a wave of love so powerful it nearly took her breath away. This was the man who had fired warning shots into the night to save a stranger, who had opened his heart despite past wounds, who would soon be the father of their child. Vaughn looked up, seeming to sense her gaze, and smiled that warm, intimate smile that was reserved for her alone. He said something to the young ranch hand assisting him, then made his way toward the house, removing his work gloves as he approached. "Shouldn't you be resting?" he asked, climbing the porch steps to stand beside her. Eleanor laughed, leaning into his embrace. "If I rest any more, I'll take root like one of Mrs. Wilkins's rosebushes. I'm with child Vaughn, not made of porcelain." He chuckled, his hand coming to rest protectively over hers on her belly. Can't blame a man for being cautious with his greatest treasures. The tender moment was interrupted by the approach of a rider coming fast down the road to the ranch. Vaughn tensed instinctively, his body shifting slightly to place himself between Eleanor and potential danger, a habit formed during his ranger days that had never fully faded. As the rider drew closer, however, Vaughn relaxed. "It's just Jimmy from the telegraph office," he observed. "Wonder what brings him out here in such a hurry." The young man reined in his horse at the foot of the porch steps, his face flushed with exertion. "Mr. Davenport." "Got an urgent telegram for you, sir." He handed over a folded paper. "Came in from Fort Laramie this morning." Vaughn thanked the boy and tipped him generously before unfolding the telegram. Eleanor watched as his expression changed from curiosity to concern. "What is it?" she asked, a flutter of worry in her chest. "It's from Marshal Lewis at Fort Laramie," Vaughn explained, his brow furrowed as he read. "The Blackburn trial has been delayed again, some problem with witnesses not appearing, and—" he paused, his jaw tightening. "3 members of the gang escaped custody 2 nights ago. They're believed to be heading south." Eleanor's hand tightened around the porch railing. "South, toward Redemption Creek, it's possible," Vaughn admitted. "The marshal is sending riders to warn the settlements in the area, but he wanted me to know specifically. I testified against them, helped bring them in. There could be a personal element to this." "What are you going to do?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Vaughn's expression was resolute as he folded the telegram and tucked it into his pocket. "First, I'm going to increase security around the ranch. No one rides alone, extra guards at night." He placed his hands gently on Eleanor's shoulders. "And I need you to promise me you'll be extra vigilant. No trips into town without Thomas or myself accompanying you." "Of course," she agreed readily. "Do you think they'll actually come here?" "I don't know," Vaughn admitted. "They'd be fools to try anything, but desperation makes men do foolish things. And these men have nothing to lose. They're facing the gallows if recaptured." Eleanor nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Should we warn the town? I'll ride in this afternoon, speak with Jenkins." Vaughn's expression softened as he noted the worry in her eyes. "Don't fret, love. We've faced worse and come through it. This will be no different." That evening, after Vaughn had returned from town with news that Jenkins was organizing increased patrols, they sat together on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Despite the potential threat looming on the horizon, there was a peace to the moment. Vaughn's arm around her shoulders, the gentle sway of the swing, the distant lowing of cattle being brought in for the night. "I've been thinking," Vaughn said, breaking the comfortable silence. "If it's a girl, I'd like to name her after your mother. You've mentioned how much she influenced your love of learning." Touched by his thoughtfulness, Eleanor smiled. "Margaret would be a lovely name, and if it's a boy, I thought perhaps Thomas after Mr. Wilkins. He's been more of a father to me these past years than my own ever was." Vaughn's fingers idly stroked Eleanor's arm as he spoke, "though I'm open to suggestions." "I like Thomas," Eleanor agreed. "Thomas Victor Davenport has a distinguished sound to it." They continued in this vein, discussing names and plans for the nursery, deliberately focusing on the joyful future rather than potential dangers. As darkness fell, however, Vaughn grew more alert, his eyes scanning the shadows beyond the yard with trained vigilance. "Come," he said finally, rising and offering Eleanor his hand. "It's getting late and you need your rest." That night, as they lay in their bed, Vaughn's arm protectively around Eleanor's waist, his hand resting on her growing belly, he pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "I want you to know," he murmured, "that I will always protect you and our child. No matter what comes, no harm will reach you while I draw breath." Eleanor turned in his embrace to face him, touched by the fierce devotion in his voice. "I know," she whispered, tracing the contours of his beloved face in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "Just as I will always protect you in my own way, that's what love means, standing guard over each other's hearts." Vaughn's kiss was tender yet tinged with an urgency born of uncertain times. As they drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, Eleanor sent up a silent prayer for continued safety for the family they were building, for the love they had found against all odds. The next week passed in a heightened state of vigilance. Vaughn doubled the night guards around the ranch, personally checked all doors and windows each evening, and kept his revolver within easy reach at all times. Eleanor noticed that several of the ranch hands now carried rifles even during routine tasks, their eyes scanning the horizon as they worked. Despite these precautions, life continued its steady rhythm. Eleanor helped Mrs. Wilkins with household tasks, prepared for the baby's arrival, and occasionally rode into town with Vaughn to maintain her connections with the community. The school board had hired a replacement teacher for the remainder of the term, but Eleanor still met weekly with the woman to offer guidance and support. On a bright Wednesday morning, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Wilkins, planning the week's meals and reviewing household accounts. Vaughn had ridden out at dawn with several hands to check on a section of fence reported damaged after a brief but intense spring storm. "We'll need more flour and sugar if you're set on making those preserves," Mrs. Wilkins was saying, her pencil poised over a list. "And Thomas mentioned the coffee's running low." "Add it to the list," Eleanor agreed. "Vaughn mentioned riding into town tomorrow. I can go with him to visit the general store." Mrs. Wilkins nodded, but her expression grew serious. "Any more news about those escaped outlaws?" "Nothing specific," Eleanor replied, unconsciously resting a protective hand on her belly. "Marshal Jenkins sent word that there have been sightings near Gallatin, but that's more than 60 miles north of here." "Let's hope they keep heading that direction," Mrs. Wilkins said firmly. "Away from decent folk." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Both women rose and moved to the window, concern evident in their expressions. One of the younger ranch hands, a boy named Ethan, no more than 18 years old, was galloping toward the house, his horse lathered with exertion. Thomas Wilkins emerged from the barn, intercepting the young rider before he reached the house. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see the boy's agitated gestures as he spoke urgently to Thomas, who nodded grimly before turning toward the house. Eleanor met him at the door, her heart pounding with sudden dread. "What is it, Thomas? Is it Vaughn?" "There's been trouble at the north pasture," Thomas confirmed, his weathered face grave. "Ethan says riders attacked the men working on the fence line. Shots fired." "Vaughn," Eleanor's voice caught on his name. "Is he?" "Boy doesn't know details," Thomas interrupted gently. "Just that there was gunfire and Mr. Davenport sent him riding for help. I'm gathering the men now." "I'm coming with you," Eleanor declared, already reaching for her shawl. "No, madam," Thomas said firmly. "Mr. Davenport would have my hide if I let you anywhere near potential danger, especially in your condition." His expression softened at the fear evident in her eyes. "We'll bring him home safe, Miss Eleanor. You have my word." With that promise, he hurried back to the barn where several ranch hands were already saddling horses and checking weapons. Eleanor watched from the porch, her hands clenched at her sides as the rescue party formed up and rode out at a gallop, dust rising in their wake. Mrs. Wilkins came to stand beside her, a shotgun cradled in her capable hands. "Come inside, dear," she urged. "Standing here worrying won't help anyone, and I don't like being exposed with those outlaws potentially about." Eleanor allowed herself to be led back inside, though every instinct screamed for her to follow Thomas and the others. Mrs. Wilkins bolted the door behind them and positioned herself near the front window, the shotgun ready across her lap. "Thomas will bring him back," she assured Eleanor, her voice steadier than her eyes. "He's faced worse in his day." "I know," Eleanor replied, though her voice trembled. "Vaughn is more than capable of handling himself." She broke off, unwilling to voice her deepest fear that this time his luck might run out. The next 2 hours were among the longest of Eleanor's life. She paced the front room, alternating between staring out the window at the empty road and trying to distract herself with mundane tasks that her shaking hands could barely complete. Mrs. Wilkins remained steadfast at her post, her sharp eyes never leaving the approach to the ranch house. It was just past midday when they heard the sound of horses, many of them, approaching at a steady pace. Eleanor rushed to the window, straining to see through the dust raised by the returning party. Her heart leaped when she spotted Vaughn at the head of the group, then plummeted when she realized he was slumped forward in the saddle, supported by Thomas riding close beside him. Eleanor flung open the front door and hurried down the porch steps, heedless of Mrs. Wilkins's warning call. As the riders drew closer, she could see that Vaughn's shirt was stained with blood, a hasty bandage wrapped around his upper chest. His face was pale beneath its tan, his eyes half closed with pain or exhaustion or both. "Vaughn," she cried, reaching the group as they reined in before the house. His eyes opened fully at the sound of her voice, focusing on her face with an effort. "Eleanor," he murmured, "told Thomas not to worry you." "Help me get him inside," Thomas directed two of the stronger hands. "Careful now, Doc says the bullet went clean through, but he's lost blood." Eleanor stepped back, allowing the men to help Vaughn from his horse and support him into the house. Her mind was racing with questions, but she forced herself to stay calm, to be useful rather than hysterical. "The guest room," she directed. "It's closest." As they settled Vaughn on the bed, Eleanor got her first clear look at his injury. The bandage around his upper chest was soaked through with blood, and his face was drawn with pain, though he made no sound of complaint. What happened? She asked Thomas as she carefully began removing Vaughn's bloodied shirt. "Ambush," Thomas replied grimly. "3 riders attacked the fence crew, shot Hank Miller in the leg before anyone knew what was happening. Mr. Davenport returned fire, hit one of them for certain. They retreated after that, but not before one of them got off a lucky shot." "The Blackburn men?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. "Most likely," Thomas confirmed. "Mr. Davenport seemed to recognize one of them, a man with a scar along his jaw." Eleanor's blood ran cold at the description. One of the bandits who had cornered her that night in town had borne such a scar. This wasn't just an opportunistic attack, it was deliberate, targeted. "Dr. Mitchell checked him before we rode back," Thomas continued. "Said the bullet passed through the muscle without hitting anything vital. Clean wound, but he needs rest and watching for fever." Mrs. Wilkins appeared with a basin of hot water, clean bandages, and the medical kit. "Out now, Thomas," she directed her husband. "Let us tend to him properly. And send one of the boys to fetch Dr. Mitchell. I want him to check that wound again now that we've got Mr. Davenport settled." As Thomas left to carry out these instructions, Eleanor carefully removed the blood-soaked bandage from Vaughn's wound. The bullet had entered just below his left collarbone and exited through his upper back, missing both his heart and lungs by mere inches. The bleeding had slowed to a steady seepage rather than the alarming flow it must have been initially. "You're going to be fine," she told Vaughn, keeping her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her throat. "But if you ever scare me like this again, Victor Vaughn Davenport, I shall be very cross indeed." A ghost of a smile touched his pale lips. "Wouldn't dream of it, Mrs. Davenport." His hand sought hers, gripping it with surprising strength. "The baby, you're all right. We're both fine," she assured him, placing his palm against her rounded belly where their child rested. "Just worried about you." With Mrs. Wilkins's help, Eleanor cleaned and rebandaged the wound, coaxing Vaughn to swallow some laudanum for the pain. By the time Dr. Mitchell arrived from town, Vaughn was resting more comfortably, though his face remained worryingly pale. The doctor's examination confirmed Thomas's earlier report. "Clean wound, no signs of serious internal damage," he declared after checking the entry and exit points. "He's lost blood, but he's strong. Keep him quiet for at least a week, watch for fever, change the bandages twice daily." He patted Eleanor's hand reassuringly. "He'll recover fully, Mrs. Davenport. Your husband is made of stern stuff." After the doctor left, Eleanor sat beside Vaughn's bed, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of sleep, the laudanum dulling both pain and awareness. Night fell, and still she maintained her vigil, dozing occasionally in the chair but never leaving his side. Near midnight, she woke to find Vaughn watching her, his blue eyes clearer than they had been since his return. "You should be in our bed," he chided softly, "not cramped in that chair." "I'm not leaving you," Eleanor replied simply. Vaughn's expression grew serious. "Eleanor, those men, they were from the Blackburn Gang. The one with the scar recognized me, called me by name. This wasn't random." "I know," she acknowledged. "Thomas told me." "They'll be back," Vaughn continued, his voice strengthening with urgency. "Today was just the beginning. They want revenge, and they won't stop until they get it or they're stopped." Eleanor's hand tightened around his. "Then we'll stop them. Jenkins has already organized a search party. They're combing the hills for any sign of the gang. Jenkins won't find them, Vaughn said with certainty. They're too clever to leave an obvious trail. They'll hide, wait, plan their next move. His eyes held hers intently. I want you to go to your sister in Boston, just until this is over. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. Leave you now? Absolutely not. Eleanor, please, Vaughn implored. I can't protect you like this. He gestured to his wounded shoulder. And I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you or the baby because of me. Nothing will happen to us, Eleanor insisted. The ranch is well guarded and I refuse to be driven away by fear. This is our home, Vaughn, our life. I won't abandon it or you. They argued in hushed voices for some time, but in the end, Vaughn's weakened condition prevented him from pressing his case effectively. Eleanor remained adamant they would face this threat together, as they had faced every challenge since that first night in Redemption Creek. Eventually, exhaustion overcame them both. Eleanor climbed carefully onto the bed beside Vaughn, mindful of his injured shoulder, and they slept fitfully as the night hours crept by. The next week passed in a tense state of watchfulness. Vaughn's wound began to heal cleanly, his strength returning faster than Dr. Mitchell had predicted. By the 5th day, he was insisting on moving about the house, though Eleanor and Mrs. Wilkins united in their efforts to prevent him from attempting anything more strenuous. Reports came daily from Marshal Jenkins, no sign of the escaped outlaws, though ranchers in the area remained on high alert. Extra men were hired to guard the Davenport ranch, patrolling the perimeter day and night. No one rode out alone, and Eleanor did not leave the safety of the ranch house and immediate yard. On the 8th day after the attack, as Vaughn sat on the front porch enjoying the morning sunshine, a rider approached from the direction of town. Eleanor, who had been reading aloud from the latest Harper's Weekly, set aside her paper and watched with Vaughn as the horseman drew closer. It's Marshal Jenkins, Vaughn observed, his posture tensing slightly despite his casual tone. Eleanor noted how his hand moved instinctively to the revolver that now rarely left his side, even within the safety of their home. She said nothing about this sign of his continuing vigilance, understanding all too well the need for constant readiness. Jenkins reined in before the porch steps, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. Davenport, Mrs. Davenport, good to see you up and about, sir. What brings you out this way, Marshal? Vaughn asked, gesturing for the lawman to join them on the porch. Jenkins dismounted and climbed the steps, accepting the offered chair with a weary sigh. Got news from Fort Laramie this morning. Thought you'd want to hear it directly. Eleanor poured a cup of coffee from the pot they'd brought outside and handed it to the marshal, who accepted it with a grateful nod. They recaptured one of the escapees, Jenkins announced after taking a sip of the hot liquid. Man named Tucker. Found him half dead from infection in an abandoned trapper's cabin about 40 miles northeast of here. Bullet wound in his side. Vaughn's expression hardened. That would be my doing. I hit one of them during the ambush. He leaned forward slightly. What did Tucker say about the others? Not much at first, Jenkins admitted. But faced with the prospect of hanging, he became more talkative. Confirmed what we suspected. They came after you specifically, Davenport, blamed you for their capture for Blackburn facing the gallows. The marshal's gaze shifted briefly to Eleanor. And they knew about Mrs. Davenport, about the baby, planned to use that knowledge. Eleanor felt a cold shiver run down her spine at these words. Vaughn's hand found hers, squeezing reassuringly despite the tension evident in his jaw. Where are the other two now? Vaughn asked, his voice carefully controlled. Jenkins set down his coffee cup. That's the good news. According to Tucker, they've given up on revenge, at least for now. The one you wounded fellow with the scar, name of Reeves, was the leader of the three. After you shot Tucker, Reeves decided the risk wasn't worth it. They were heading for the Dakota Territory, planning to lie low until things settled down. You believe him? Vaughn asked skeptically. Jenkins shrugged. Man's facing the hangman's noose, not much point in lying at this stage. And it fits with what we know. No further attacks or sightings in the area for over a week now. The news should have been reassuring, but Eleanor could see that Vaughn remained unconvinced. His eyes scanned the distant horizon as if expecting to see enemies approaching at any moment. "I appreciate you bringing the news personally, Jenkins," Vaughn said finally. "But I think we'll maintain our security measures for a while longer just to be certain." "Can't fault you for caution," Jenkins agreed, rising to take his leave. "I'll keep you informed if we hear anything else." After the marshal had ridden away, Eleanor turned to Vaughn, studying his troubled expression. "You don't believe they've gone, do you?" Vaughn sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of deep concern. "I want to," he admitted. "But men like Reeves don't abandon vendettas easily. My instincts tell me this isn't over." Eleanor nodded, trusting his judgment implicitly. "Then we remain vigilant." "And you remain safe," Vaughn added firmly, his hand coming to rest protectively on her rounded belly. "Our child deserves to be born into peace, not danger." "He will be," Eleanor assured him, covering his hand with hers. They had taken to referring to the baby as he in recent weeks, though neither had any real preference regarding gender. "We've faced worse odds and prevailed, Vaughn." "This will be no different." Vaughn's smile was tender as he leaned forward to kiss her gently. "Your courage continues to amaze me, Mrs. Davenport." "I learned from the best, Mr. Davenport," she replied with a small smile of her own. The days lengthened as May gave way to June, bringing warmer weather and the busy activity of early summer on the ranch. Vaughn's wound healed completely, allowing him to resume his full duties, though Eleanor noticed he no longer rode out to the furthest pastures, preferring to stay closer to the ranch house and to her. As Eleanor's pregnancy progressed, her movements became more restricted by natural causes rather than security concerns. She found herself spending more time on the shaded porch or in the comfortable parlor, putting the finishing touches on baby garments and preparing for the child who would arrive in less than 2 months. The heightened security measures remained in place, though they had become so routine as to be almost unnoticeable. The ranch hands still rode in pairs, the night guards continued their vigilant patrols, and Vaughn's revolver never left his side. But as weeks passed with no sign of trouble, a cautious optimism began to take hold. On a particularly hot afternoon in late June, Eleanor sat in the parlor with Mrs. Wilkins, sorting through a trunk of baby things that had been stored in the attic: tiny gowns, soft blankets, and a beautifully carved cradle that Vaughn had discovered among his family's possessions. "This cradle must be at least 50 years old," Mrs. Wilkins observed, running her hand over the smooth wood. "Beautifully made. Vaughn says it was his grandfather's, then his father's, then his," Eleanor replied, carefully folding a delicate christening gown. "I'm glad he kept these things, even though—" She trailed off, not wanting to mention the baby daughter Vaughn had lost during the war. Mrs. Wilkins understood the unspoken reference. "It's healing for him, I think," she said gently. "Using these things for your child, it's a way of connecting the past to the future, of honoring what was lost while embracing what's to come." Eleanor nodded, blinking back unexpected tears. Pregnancy had made her more emotional, more susceptible to sudden waves of feeling. "I just want everything to be perfect for this baby, safe and peaceful and full of love." "And it will be," Mrs. Wilkins assured her, patting her hand. "You and Mr. Davenport will see to that." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps on the porch. Before either woman could react, the front door burst open and Thomas Wilkins rushed in, his expression grave. "Fire in the south pasture," he announced breathlessly. "Deliberate by the looks of it. Mr. Davenport and the men are trying to contain it before it reaches the hay barn." Eleanor struggled to her feet, her hand instinctively going to her belly. "Is everyone all right? Where's Vaughn?" "He's directing the firefighting efforts," Thomas replied, already turning to leave. "Says for you to stay put, Mrs. Davenport. He's concerned this might be a diversion." "A diversion?" Eleanor repeated, a cold dread settling in her stomach. "You mean we don't know for certain," Thomas interrupted, "but Mr. Davenport doesn't believe in coincidences, not after everything that's happened." He addressed his wife directly. "Martha, you know what to do, Mrs. Wilkins nodded grimly, moving to retrieve the shotgun she kept in the hall closet. "We'll be ready, Thomas. You go help with that fire." As Thomas hurried out, Mrs. Wilkins checked that the shotgun was loaded before moving methodically through the house, securing windows and doors. Eleanor watched her efficient movements, feeling suddenly helpless in her advanced state of pregnancy. "What can I do?" she asked, unwilling to be merely a passive observer. Mrs. Wilkins handed her Vaughn's spare revolver from the desk drawer. "Keep this with you," she instructed. "And stay away from the windows. We'll wait in the kitchen. It's the most defensible room if someone tries to enter the house." Eleanor followed her to the kitchen, her mind racing. Was this truly the return of the Blackburn men, as Vaughn had feared? Or simply an unfortunate accident being viewed through the lens of their recent experiences? From the kitchen window, they could see a plume of dark smoke rising from the direction of the south pasture. The ranch yard was eerily deserted, all available hands having rushed to fight the fire. The afternoon was quiet except for the distant shouts of men battling the blaze. "I don't like this," Mrs. Wilkins muttered, her sharp eyes scanning the approach to the house. "Too quiet." Eleanor was about to respond when a movement at the edge of the barn caught her attention. "Mrs. Wilkins," she whispered urgently, pointing. A man was slipping along the side of the barn, keeping to the shadows, a rifle in his hands. Even from this distance, Eleanor could make out the distinctive scar that ran along his jaw. "Reeves, get down, Mrs. Wilkins hissed, pulling Eleanor away from the window. "He's not alone. Look by the corral." A second man had appeared, moving with the stealthy precision of a predator toward the house. "They waited," Eleanor whispered, understanding dawning with terrible clarity. All this time they were watching, waiting for the perfect opportunity. "And with most of the men fighting that fire, they think they have it," Mrs. Wilkins replied grimly. She positioned herself near the kitchen door, shotgun ready. "Stay behind me, Mrs. Davenport." Eleanor's heart pounded frantically as she clutched the revolver Vaughn had taught her to use. Fear for herself, for her unborn child, for Vaughn fighting a fire that now appeared to be a deliberate trap, all of it threatened to overwhelm her. But beneath the fear was a steely determination. These men had threatened her family once too often. They would not succeed, not today, not ever. "We need to warn Vaughn," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "If this is a trap, he needs to know." "No time," Mrs. Wilkins replied tersely. "They're almost at the house. The only warning we can give is a shot, and that might bring them running straight to us." A floorboard creaked in the front room, a soft sound that might have gone unnoticed on any other day, but now rang like a clarion in the tense silence. Someone was inside the house. Mrs. Wilkins raised the shotgun, aiming it steadily at the kitchen door. Eleanor moved to stand beside her, Vaughn's revolver held in both hands to keep it from shaking. "Remember what Mr. Davenport taught you," Mrs. Wilkins murmured. "Aim for the center, don't hesitate." The kitchen door began to open slowly, pushed by an unseen hand from the other side. Eleanor's finger moved to the trigger, her breath held in anticipation of the confrontation to come. The door swung wide to reveal not Reeves or his companion, but a young ranch hand named David, his face smudged with soot from the fire. "Mrs. Davenport," he exclaimed, raising his hands quickly at the sight of the weapons aimed at him. "It's just me. Mr. Davenport sent me to check on you." Mrs. Wilkins lowered her shotgun with a relieved sigh. "Land's sakes, boy, you nearly got yourself shot sneaking in like that. Didn't you think to call out?" "I did, madam," David replied, his youthful face confused. "Called out soon as I entered the house. Didn't you hear me?" A cold certainty settled over Eleanor. "We didn't hear anything," she said slowly, "because someone else is in the house, someone who doesn't want to be heard." David's eyes widened in understanding, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. Where his question was cut short by a deafening blast as a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the doorframe inches from his head. David dove for cover as Mrs. Wilkins pulled Eleanor down behind the solid oak table, appending it to create a barricade. "That came from the hallway, Mrs. Wilkins whispered, her face pale but determined. David had taken position at the side of the door, his pistol drawn. "At least one gunman," he reported in a low voice. "Possibly the escaped Blackburn men Mr. Davenport warned us about." There were two outside, Eleanor informed him, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. One by the barn, one near the corral. David's expression tightened. They planned this well. The fire was just to draw the men away from the house. He glanced at Eleanor, his young face suddenly looking much older with responsibility. I need to get you out of here, Mrs. Davenport. Mr. Davenport would never forgive me if anything happened to you or the baby. We're surrounded, Mrs. Wilkins pointed out practically. No way out except through them. Another shot rang out, this one passing through the kitchen window and embedding itself in the far wall. Eleanor flinched but kept her grip steady on the revolver. They're trying to frighten us, she observed, make us panic. Well, it ain't working, Mrs. Wilkins declared firmly. We've faced worse than a couple of yellow-bellied outlaws, haven't we, Mrs. Davenport? Despite the dire circumstances, Eleanor found herself smiling at the older woman's indomitable spirit. Indeed we have, Mrs. Wilkins. David was moving carefully to the window, staying low to avoid presenting a target. I can see one of them, he reported. Moving toward the back door, if I can get a clear shot. Before he could complete the thought, the kitchen's back door burst open with a splintering crash. Reeves stood framed in the doorway, his scarred face twisted in a triumphant snarl, rifle aimed directly at Eleanor. Found you, he growled. Time to settle accounts with Davenport, and what better way than through his pretty wife and unborn brat? Several things happened simultaneously. David swung his pistol toward Reeves. Mrs. Wilkins raised her shotgun with surprising speed for a woman of her years. And Eleanor, acting on instinct rather than conscious thought, squeezed the trigger of Vaughn's revolver. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the kitchen. Reeves staggered backward, a look of shock replacing his sneer as a crimson stain spread across his chest. He fired wildly as he fell, his bullet going wide and shattering a ceramic pitcher on the sideboard. David was moving instantly, rushing to the doorway to check if Reeves was truly down and to look for the second outlaw. Mrs. Wilkins remained at Eleanor's side, her shotgun still ready. Good shot, she commented with grim approval. Right in the center, just like Mr. Davenport taught you. Eleanor could only nod, a strange numbness spreading through her as the reality of what she'd just done sank in. She had taken a man's life. Even in self-defense, even to protect her unborn child, it was a sobering, terrible thing. Mrs. Davenport, David called urgently from the doorway. Reeves is down, but the other one's still out there somewhere. We need to. His warning was cut short by a volley of gunfire from outside, not directed at the house this time, but exchanged between multiple parties in the ranch yard. Eleanor recognized one of the voices shouting commands amid the chaos. Vaughn. It's Mr. Davenport, David confirmed, relief evident in his voice. He's brought the men back from the fire. The shooting continued for another minute before abruptly ceasing. An eerie silence fell, broken only by the sound of running footsteps approaching the house. Eleanor, Vaughn's voice rang out, frantic with worry. Eleanor, in the kitchen, she called back, her voice shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. We're all right. Vaughn burst into the kitchen, his face streaked with soot from the fire, his eyes wild with fear until they found Eleanor. In 2 strides, he crossed the room and gathered her into his arms, holding her as if he might never let go. I thought I'd lost you, he whispered against her hair. When we realized the fire was a diversion, when I saw Reeves's partner trying to flee. I'm all right, Eleanor assured him, clinging to his solid warmth. We all are. Mrs. Wilkins and David protected me. She hesitated, then added softly, and I shot Reeves when he came through the back door. Vaughn pulled back slightly to look at her face, his expression a complex mixture of pride, sorrow, and understanding. You did what you had to do, he said gently, to protect yourself and our child. Eleanor nodded, grateful for his understanding. Is it over now, truly over? Yes, Vaughn confirmed. Reeves's partner is dead. Thomas got him as he tried to escape, and with Reeves, he glanced at the body lying just outside the back door. Yes, it's over. In the aftermath, as the ranch slowly returned to normal, Eleanor found herself processing the events of that day with surprising resilience. The nightmares she had expected of Reeves's face as her bullets struck him, of what might have happened had her aim been less true, never materialized. Instead, she felt a quiet certainty that she had done what was necessary to protect those she loved. Vaughn, too, seemed to find a peace that had eluded him since the first attack. With the threat of the Blackburn men finally and decisively eliminated, he relaxed his vigilance, though certain habits remained: the revolver within easy reach, the careful scanning of horizons, the preference for being near the ranch house rather than in distant pastures. 2 weeks after the attack, as they sat together on the porch swing in the cool evening air, Vaughn placed his hand on Eleanor's belly, smiling as he felt the strong kicks of their active child. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice contemplative. "This land, this ranch, it's a good place to raise a family, but it's also isolated, far from certain advantages that I want our children to have." "Children, plural," Eleanor teased gently. "Let's get through this one first, shall we?" Vaughn chuckled, the sound warm in the gathering darkness. "Fair enough, but my point stands. I've been thinking about building a second home in Redemption Creek, not to replace the ranch, but as a place where we could stay during the school term." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "In town, why?" "For education," he explained. "I want our children to have the best schooling possible, and that means regular attendance, not the sporadic arrangement that ranch children typically endure." His expression grew more serious. "And if, someday, you wish to return to teaching, you'd consider that?" Eleanor asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I'd more than consider it," Vaughn replied. "I've seen how you light up when you talk about your students, about opening young minds to new ideas. It's part of who you are, Eleanor. I wouldn't ask you to abandon it forever." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. Not for the first time that day, pregnancy had made her emotional in ways she wasn't entirely comfortable with. "I love you, Vaughn Davenport," she said simply, "more than I have words to express." His kiss was tender, a promise and a pledge renewed with each passing day. "And I love you, Eleanor Davenport. You and this child and any others who might come along are the greatest blessing of my life." As they sat together watching the stars emerge in the velvet sky, Eleanor felt a profound contentment settle over her. The journey that had begun that night when she was cornered by bandits and a cowboy rode in firing shots had led her here to love, to family, to a future brighter than any she could have imagined when she first arrived in Redemption Creek. Their story, like the West itself, had been forged in moments of danger and courage, in choices made when the stakes were highest. But it would continue in peace, in the everyday triumphs and challenges of building a life together, in the legacy they would create for their children and their children's children. "What are you thinking about?" Vaughn asked softly, his arm tightening around her shoulders. Eleanor smiled, leaning her head against his chest where she could hear the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "I was thinking that some stories begin with bullets and danger," she replied, "but the best ones continue with love and hope." Vaughn's answering smile held all the promise of the future stretching before them. "And ours is just beginning, my love, just beginning." On a bright August morning, with sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows of the Davenport ranch house, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Thomas Victor Davenport entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to his father's eyes and a triumphant smile to his exhausted mother's face. "He's perfect," Vaughn whispered, cradling his son with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." Eleanor watched them together, her strong, brave husband reduced to awe by the tiny being in his arms, and felt her heart might burst with happiness. This was everything she had ever wanted without knowing she wanted it. A family built on love and mutual respect, a home filled with warmth and security, a future rich with possibilities. As word spread throughout Redemption Creek of the newest Davenport's arrival, visitors began arriving at the ranch bearing gifts and well wishes. The Wilkinses beamed with pride as honorary grandparents. Marshall Jenkins brought a hand-carved wooden horse that he'd apparently been working on for weeks. Even Abigail Turner from the dressmaking shop made the journey out to the ranch, bringing a beautifully embroidered christening gown and barely disguised curiosity about the Davenport domestic arrangements. In the months that followed, Vaughn made good on his promise to build a second home in town, a comfortable two-story house with a spacious garden, just down the street from the schoolhouse. Though they spent most of their time at the ranch, the townhouse became a welcome retreat during harsh winter weather and would serve its intended purpose when young Thomas was old enough for formal schooling. Eleanor did eventually return to teaching, though not full-time. She began by offering special classes for advanced students 2 afternoons a week, gradually expanding her role as Thomas grew older and more independent. The school board welcomed her expertise, and her students thrived under her guidance. The Davenport family grew as well. A daughter, Margaret Martha, joined them 2 years after Thomas's birth, followed by another son, James, 3 years later. Each child brought new joy, new challenges, and new dimensions to the love that had begun on that fateful night when a schoolteacher was cornered by bandits, and a former Texas Ranger rode to her rescue. Redemption Creek grew and prospered as the territories moved toward statehood. The railroad arrived, bringing new opportunities and connections to the wider world. Vaughn expanded his ranching operations, adopting modern methods while maintaining the personal touch that made the Davenport brand respected throughout the region. Through it all, the triumphs and setbacks, the joys and sorrows that constitute a life fully lived, Vaughn and Eleanor remained each other's strength and sanctuary. Their love, forged in danger and nurtured in peace, became the stuff of local legend, a romance that had begun with gunfire and bandits, but blossomed into one of the great love stories of Redemption Creek. On their 20th wedding anniversary, with their children nearly grown and the century drawing to a close, Vaughn and Eleanor stood together on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set in a blaze of glory over the land that had become so much a part of their shared identity. "Any regrets?" Vaughn asked, his arm around Eleanor's waist, his voice softened by years of happiness. Eleanor looked up at him, at the silver threading his dark hair, at the laugh lines crinkling the corners of his still vibrant blue eyes, at the face that had become as familiar and necessary to her as breath itself, and smiled. "Not a single one," she replied with absolute certainty. "Every step of the journey led us here together. What could be more perfect than that?" Vaughn's kiss held the same tenderness, the same passion that had always existed between them, now deepened by years of shared experience and unwavering commitment. "Nothing," he murmured against her lips. "Nothing at all." And as the last rays of sunlight gilded the prairie grass and cast long shadows across the land they had made their own, Eleanor knew with bone-deep certainty that their love story begun in danger, sustained through challenge, and fulfilled in the quiet joy of lives well lived together, was the greatest adventure either of them could have imagined. Not an ending, but a continuation each day, writing a new chapter in the story that had begun that night when she was cornered by bandits in the street, and a cowboy rode in firing shots and pulled her away to safety, to love, to home.